top. Give it a second to connect.
Oh, you need to cut some of my fat off.
I don't know what to do about that, buddy. Try that.
All right.
Too close to the camera. Welcome to the Critical Christian. What? What are you doing? You want to sit on my lap?
All right.
Welcome to the Critical Christian Podcast.
Wait, that is literally my line.
Or do it? Yeah, sorry, that was
All
your
right.
line.
Welcome to the Critical Christian Podcast. We're your hosts, Dan
And Justin. We ask critical questions about the Bible and provide questionable answers. And today we are finally in the first section of the biblical laws. Aren't you really excited for this?
No, I'm not.
You didn't want to read the laws?
They're very they're anger inducing. You know?
You don't like some of them.
Oh,
What you're saying?
yeah, I don't like some of them. That's what I'm saying, because they're bananas.
That's fair.
Don't want to use the B word, but I just did. All right.
Fair enough. Okay. Well, with that, then, I mean, I think the hardest ones are right at the beginning.
Oh yeah.
I don't know how far we'll get.
I know. Well, we're gonna try to do it all. I mean, it's only 6:30.
I know you think we're going to go for 4 hours, but
I can go all night.
I mean, a man can.
Yeah, I can. Okay. So you want to do this?
I think just jump right in, buddy. Do you want to read the first section, or did you have something to say before we go on?
Oh, I have a preamble.
All right, let's have the preamble to Exodus 21, buddy.
It's so long. It's
Right.
It's like an address. All right. So, as a less questioning individual, I thought that these laws concerning slaves, is that good?
Yeah, don't worry about it.
All right. If I were a less questioning individual, I would have thought that these laws concerning slavery were actually pretty forward thinking. In fact, I did think that when I was younger, that they were progressive, comparatively speaking. Like, if you're going to have slaves, at the very least, you should treat them humanely. Mm-hmm. So that made sense. Mm-hmm. But then later in life, I realized something that now is pretty obvious, which is to say that God could have simply outlawed slavery.
Well, we're going to get there, buddy.
Yeah. So, I mean, I know there's an argument that since slavery was so ingrained in society, that the Israelites would have been less likely to follow God because getting rid of their slaves was a big ask. But God asked a lot of other things from the Israelites, and there's no reason
a lot.
God could not have commanded them to also not own slaves. And this, of course, gets into slavery in America, our so-called Christian nation that isn't. Because it appears to me as though, according to the Bible, God was pretty cool with slavery. Not simply, well, if you must, at least do it humanely. Because it's slavery. And I think most people realize the inherent wrongness of slavery, which is to say that God did not outright make slavery illegal, especially when the Israelites themselves were slaves. And that just kind of boggles my mind. I mean, I'm sure you're going to correct me to say it wasn't actually slavery in the way we think of it, but more of an agreement in exchange for being taken care of. But that's actually the argument Americans made, because, they were just savages and we were helping them.
Actually, yeah, now you mentioned that, Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, literally said that in one of his speeches. We can get it out and read it if we need to, but he literally chastised the North for saying, where do you get the moral outrage against slavery when, certainly the Bible's not against it. In fact, the Bible says the exact opposite of it. And how better to bring the savage to Christianity than through slavery?
Yeah. I mean, this is similar to the Native Americans, except they just killed them. So, I don't know. I think you're also going to later mention laws concerning slave ownership and treatment. The ones that the Israelites followed were actually harsher than the surrounding nations. So I guess what I'm trying to say is humanity has largely been a piece of shit all throughout history.
Yeah, and I think if you ever wondered, like, if morals are subjective or objective,
Yeah.
I think the slave laws throughout history demonstrate they're probably subjective because humanity almost kind of universally didn't care about slavery for a long time, for most of history.
Yeah.
It wasn't until the modern time that people started questioning, hey, maybe we shouldn't be doing it.
Mm. Yeah.
It's easy for us to look back on the times and critique them because we're not there. But one thing I often think about is like, people are going to look back on us 600, 700, 800 and critique
I
what
mean,
we
the
were
Earth
doing
won't be
wrong.
around at that point. It'll be the new Earth.
Well, what I'm saying is I'm quite curious to know,
Yes, sir.
what about our society currently would people
I
critique
mean,
the same way we're critiquing the?
I'm sure there are quite a lot of things.
Yeah, actually are quite a few things. But that being said, let's maybe get into the first couple verses.
Let's
Let's
do
read
it.
verse 1 through 4.
Okay, old pal. These are the ordinances that you shall set before them. When you buy a male Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, but in the 7th he shall go out a free person without debt. If he comes in single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out alone. That's pretty progressive, right? You know what I mean? So I assume we're to believe that God dictated these laws to Moses, so it's not just Moses making them up, right? I mean,
Yeah, that is what the Bible says. In fact, Moses says on a number of occasions in Deuteronomy and Exodus and Leviticus how God is giving the laws. So he says, for example, in Deuteronomy 4, you must neither add anything to what I am commanding you, nor take anything away from it, but keep the commandments of the Lord your God, which I am giving you charge. A lot of the slavery laws get reiterated in Deuteronomy. And even in Exodus, it says, verse 1, these are the ordinances that you shall set before them. Namely, God saying, you, Moses, shall set these before them.
Right, yeah.
So I think it's pretty clear that these laws are coming from God. Moses is not making them up.
Yeah. So if we're to believe that God was dictating these laws, I thought God was supposed to be all loving.
Right.
I mean, however, he certainly had a way with determining the value of life, which is to say, it seems to have had very little value. I don't know. It's just weird. I mean, there are only 2 ways to look at it. One, God isn't as nice as he's not all loving. How's that? Or this was just bullshit. Moses might have just stuck his head into a hat.
Right. Well, it's important to remember too that these ancient law codes were like copying from each other. Like there's sections in here that copy directly from Middle Assyrian laws and the Hammurabi laws, and they even show up in the same order. So, from my perspective, I would say that none of these came from God because it was all invented, stolen from cultures. But from your perspective, it's very difficult because if you take the Bible to be true, then you have to assume that God was okay with these laws, and then your next thing is, okay, well, if God is okay with these laws, what does that say about God?
Right.
And I've got a good friend who just outright says, I mean, God is not all good or all loving. It doesn't have to be.
Is he a Christian?
Yeah.
Yeah, very odd.
But that does kind of betray this idea in the Bible where it says like God is love, like God is the equivalent of love, and it also says he's merciful and long suffering and so on and so forth. Well, if he's all these things, then you'd think he would not,
Is it possible that say we know God is all good and all loving. Say we just know that about him. Okay, that's a quality we know. We don't have. It's not faith.
How do we know it?
We just do. This is a thought experiment.
Okay, so in the thought experiment, we do know it.
Right.
Okay.
Could we look at the Bible and then just erase everything that goes against that?
Well, some people have tried to do that, and the problem is, if you do that, it's very subjective. Like up to the individual person to determine what fits that characteristic.
Mm-hmm.
You see what I'm saying?
I get that.
Because there are a lot of apologists who will go in there and say, no, the slavery was a good thing because it brought these foreigners to know the Lord because they became members of the households.
I mean, you could just ask them who they voted for. You know? I don't know.
Yeah. But that's what I'm saying is when we're looking at the laws, we say, well, what fits like a loving God? That's a very subjective marker on what people think is loving.
Yeah, I just feel like there are some things we should all be able to agree on. Except I know that's not true because there are many Christians who will just say, huh? That's right. God. Right. Do as I say, not as I do.
And one of the bigger problems with this is like you'll see hermeneutics from like conservative apologists and scholars that will say like, well, you know, this is the best God could do for the time. You know, for example, if you grab a commentary back here, you've been reading a little bit from Eugene Carpenter's commentary, but this is one place where I feel like Eugene Carpenter has really been coping with the text rather than actually, you know, just dealing with what it says properly.
Mm-hmm.
When you go to chapter 21 in Eugene Carpenter's commentary, he says something really interesting about the slavery. You grab it. Sorry for the delay. I didn't think to have it ready. I thought about it just now. Okay, so he says in the commentary, when it in regards to the slaves, let me see if I can find the right page. But his basic apologetic for this is that at this point in time, you know, God was not able to give them laws that would free them from the current social structures that they were currently part of. Like they were more or less, you know, trapped within their culture. It wasn't God couldn't do anything about it. You know, it's like this progressive thing. God had to take them out of it in steps.
That's what people always say as the excuse. You know,
right?
It was just part of their culture.
I'm trying to remember if this. Yeah, it's got to be right around.
Slavery was a part of our culture.
Well, it was. Yeah, it really was. He does talk a little bit on the Code of Hammurabi, but he stops short of quoting Law Code 117.
Okay.
Law Code 117 in Hammurabi talks about these debt service. And in Hammurabi, they go free after 3 years, not after 6 years. So it's actually more progressive in the Hammurabi Law Code.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting.
Yeah, I don't like when that happens. You know, today I was subbing for a class, and it was an English class, and they were actually learning about Martin Luther King Jr., coincidentally. And so I watched his, you know, Free at Last speech 3 times.
Well, just recently was
Martin Luther King Jr.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, it fits. I'm just saying it's an interesting coincidence that they all line up.
So this is what he says, and this is the apologetic you'll hear a lot. Because of Israel's God and his compassion for his people, Israel's laws were intrinsically more humane than the laws of the rest of the ancient Near East, although they also share much of the laws of those people and the nation. In Hammurabi Law Code, different levels of social standing regulated more stringently the appropriate punishment meted out to the 3 principal classes of persons: the commoner, the inferior. The commoner who was inferior to gentlemen, and then also the gentleman, and then the slave, royal subject. And he does go on to give some more apologetics for the slavery, but here's why I bring Eugene Carpenter up here, because he's a brilliant scholar. You know, I love him to death, but he's using the same bad apologetic that any person off the street would use.
Yeah.
it was more humane. God couldn't do anything else. His hands were tied.
Right.
But that's kind of a silly apologetic when you're an all-powerful God.
Right.
And you told them to do all kinds of stuff that you knew they wouldn't follow. You told them not to commit adultery.
Right.
Even your chosen king committed adultery. The guy after your own heart committed adultery, right?
Mm.
So like he gave them all kinds of laws he knew they weren't going to follow. So it doesn't make sense that he's like, well, they're not going to follow the slavery law, so I can't tell them not to. That's a ridiculous apologetic.
Right.
Right? And then the other thing too is he doesn't go on to say, like, now that you have these slaves, I need you to treat them really nicely.
Right.
Because that's just not there. What we do find, especially maybe we should look at Leviticus 25, is he kind of says the opposite. I don't know if you flipped over to Leviticus 25 during this chat.
Do you think I did?
I don't know. I just figured you'd look at the topic of turning your microphone is picking up my voice. That's why I keep turning it away from me.
Oh, is that better?
Yeah.
You turned it off.
Sorry.
Just so you know.
I was just trying to move it so it wasn't picking me up. That way we don't get echoes.
Echo. Okay. All right.
It's still picking me up. Hold on. Let me just fix the filter.
I'll just move all the way over here.
Well, usually you're not on top of me when we're doing this.
Yeah. I don't know.
All right, give me a second. All right, it should be better now. Okay. So, anyways, what I'm saying is, in Leviticus and elsewhere, we have these slave laws
Echo
that are pretty clearly telling you not to treat the foreign slaves like they're Hebrews. Right. Well, while we're in 21, let's first of all just dispel a myth.
Okay.
You can beat your slave, and you can beat them very harshly.
Oh yeah.
It says in 20.
No. We're gonna get to that. You're spoiling it.
Sure, we're gonna get to that.
Get to that,
buddy. I don't know how much is gonna happen in this chapter.
We'll get to it next week then.
All right. Okay. Well, nevertheless,
ruining the surprises.
The Bible does explain that you're not supposed to treat certain slaves harshly, but you can treat other slaves harshly.
Right, like you can't have Jewish slaves, right?
Well, you can, and we'll get to that in Exodus 21. But let's read this section real quick from.
I read Exodus 21.
I know, we're gonna read it again. If any who are dependent on you become so impoverished that they sell themselves to you, you shall not make them serve as slaves. They shall remain with you as hired or bound laborers. They shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. Then they and their children with them shall go out from your authority. They shall go back to their own family and return to their ancestral property. For they are my servants who I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves, or shall not rule over them with harshness, but you shall fear your God. And if they left it at that, you might say, oh, that seems a little bit better.
Yeah.
But then he goes on and says this: as for the male and female slaves who you may have, it is from the nations around you that you may acquire male and female slaves. You may also acquire them from among the aliens residing with you and from their families who are with you, who have been born in your land, and they may be your property. You may keep them as a possession for your children after you, for them to inherit as property. These you may treat as slaves. But as for your fellow Israelites, no one shall rule over the other with harshness.
That's what I just said. I said Jewish people aren't allowed to have Jewish slaves.
And you would be wrong.
It just said that.
I know it says that, but that's only for the men.
Oh.
Only for men.
Oh.
Because women didn't typically sell themselves. You look at the context here. It says, if any who are dependent on you become so impoverished that they sell themselves to you. And then what happens at the year of Jubilee, they go to their ancestral property. These are men, not women. Women don't have ancestral property. Women don't get to make their own destiny. Don't get to sell themselves. They are sold as property of somebody else, which is clear in verse 7 of Exodus 21. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, he's not choosing to become a slave. She's being sold as a slave because she's already somebody's property.
Okay. Okay.
A woman in this time period is always somebody else's property, essentially. She's under somebody's authority, a man's authority, at least in this culture, not necessarily all the culture. But it says of the slaves, even the women, right? If we read verse 4, if his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, and the wife of her, the wife and her children shall be her masters, and he shall out alone. But what's being said here is that if there's a guy who goes in to serve for 6 years, and the slave master gives him a wife, if he has a family with that woman, they are still permanent property of the owner, even after that guy is done with his years of service. They're permanent slaves forever, and these are, ostensibly Hebrew women and children, right? And that lines up with verse 7, where it says, "Man sells his daughter as a slave, that she shall not go out as the male slave do." So there's definitely this idea that, even among the Hebrews, the women, when they're sold into slavery, they're just perpetual slaves. And if you're born to a slave, guess what?
You're a slave.
You're a slave.
That's what happened in America, too.
Oh, yeah. There were entire books and manuals published on how to breed your slaves.
Yeah.
Because eventually they did outlaw the importing of slaves. And so people wanted to do everything they could to breed their slaves.
Yeah.
So they wouldn't run out of slaves.
It's despicable.
Right.
So, all right, should I go ahead and read 5 and 6 then?
Well, let me see if there's anything we need to mention here on this passage here. I think everyone knows that, if you're a slave, but you actually go free in the 7th year, you're not really a slave. You're an indentured servant. It's not great. It's not grand. It's not going to have a party. But at the end of the day, you're still at that point, at least, you're like being compensated for your labor somehow. But only if you're a man. If you're a woman, not so much.
Right.
Because when you were sold as a slave, your reproductive capacity belongs to your owner now. Which we'll get there. Go ahead and read the next 2 verses, 5 and 6.
So, if however but if the slave declares, "I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out a free person," then his master shall bring him before God. He shall be brought to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him for life. It's like a knife or something, I guess.
No, it's a wooden peg.
It's it's the same thing, right? The idea is to pierce the ear.
Yeah, that is the goal.
Doesn't matter if it's a wooden peg or a knife, right? Anyhow, so
they had metal awls too. Anyways, go ahead.
Okay. So, so if the male slave wants to stay with his family, he is enslaved forever.
That's right.
Here's a tangent. So Jesus came to. All right. People say Jesus came to abolish them. Now, I mean, he didn't, but people say that.
He, in fact, said the opposite of that.
But my point is that it was literally never all right to own slaves, and the fact that God was even a little okay with it at any point in history says to me that maybe God's morality is a little different than mine.
Right? Yeah.
I don't know.
No, I think you nailed it.
Okay.
The problem, though, is that in the Bible, God says that all of these laws are forever. That you will follow these laws every day that you live on the earth.
So if Jesus came to fulfill the laws, ... That's
what?
We should sell slaves, apparently.
Yeah. Because Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, he said, "I did not come to abolish the law." Okay, so no matter what you think the word fulfill means, fulfill does not mean abolish. They're clearly opposites, which means he's saying, I came to actually complete the laws. I came to do them. Just like I fulfilled the law of buckling my seatbelt. That doesn't mean I don't have to buckle my seatbelt next time. But he says in Matthew Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass away from the law until all is accomplished. So, till heaven and earth passes away, the law is established. But he doubles down. He says, therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So if we take Jesus' word seriously, Jesus is definitely pro-law of Moses.
Listen, I have a question. Jesus, he quoted some of the books in the Bible, right? Which ones?
Kind of.
What do you mean, kind of?
Well, he like quasi quoted Deuteronomy 24 when he talked about the law of divorce.
Okay.
And he did, when he sent the lepers to the temple to be after being cleansed, the book of I think Luke says that Jesus sent them to the temple saying that they needed to complete their ritual purity. He also when the rich young ruler came to him and asked him, what must I do to be saved? And he pointed him to the laws of Moses. And there's a number of times in Luke chapter 4, he quotes Isaiah 61. He doesn't quote it correctly, but he quotes it.
All right, stop. I got an idea in my head and it's falling out. Okay. So if Jesus quoted Deuteronomy, now does Deuteronomy have laws in it too? Are they similar to these for slavery? That it says it's okay to have slaves in Deuteronomy, and Jesus knows Deuteronomy as a book, and he's quoting from it. And Jesus came here to fulfill the law. You see the problem here, right?
Yeah, Jesus is pro law of Moses. In fact, in Matthew, is it Matthew 23? I think it's Matthew 23.
Because I'd like to say that these are just for Moses, and so they're not, whatever. They're not from God. But if Jesus, knows about Deuteronomy and he didn't say, oh, by the way, those aren't from God, you know what I mean? Then it seems like he's approving of them. And that makes me confused.
He definitely approves of them quite a bit. If you go, I was Matthew 22 is where I was looking for. And Matthew 22 says, when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, an expert in law, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? And he said to them, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your mind. That's Deuteronomy 6:5. Then he says, next, the second greatest, this is the greatest and the first commandment. The second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's a quotation from Leviticus 19:8.
Okay.
So Jesus is quoting laws from Deuteronomy and Leviticus, saying that these are where we can find literally the greatest of the laws.
Right.
And then he says, on these two commandments hang all of the law and the prophets, which means he's literally saying that all of the laws that are given in the 5 books of Moses, all of those laws are congruent with those other 2 commandments, meaning owning another human being as property does not violate the law of loving your neighbor as yourself.
Because they're property, right?
Because you're your property, not your neighbor.
Right. It's funny, I always thought neighbor was anybody.
It's a difficult word. In Hebrew, the word re'ah typically refers to somebody who is like your kinsman or your companion. It could also just refer to like somebody who is close to you. And so when we use the word neighbor kind of out of tradition, but it could literally refer to a distant cousin. It could refer to a close friend. It could even refer to a close business associate. It's just somebody that is very close to you, sometimes physically close to you, like a neighbor.
Okay. Because I really thought, we were all neighbors in this human race. You know what I mean? That's not it.
Couldn't be. Your neighbor is typically one of your own kind.
Okay. That sucks. A lot. Sucks a lot.
I think Jesus' notion of who is your neighbor was different than what the Old Testament points out, though. I think the parable of the Good Samaritan was meant to kind of break the mold of, oh, your neighbor's not just your kinsman, could be outsiders too. But in God's law, in Deuteronomy and Leviticus and Exodus and whatnot, it's very clear who your neighbor is, not the foreigner slave. That's your property. In
Yeah.
fact, Exodus 21 says it. We'll get there.
We'll get there.
But
All
on 5 and 6, though, I've always kind of read this as like a bit of a loophole.
Okay.
Like, you've got this male Hebrew slave, and you're like, well, I'd really like to keep him longer than 6 years. I'll just give him a little hotty-toddy slave to sleep with.
Yeah.
And, you know, if he knocks her up, guess what? I get more slaves. If he knocks her up and he really likes her, I get more slaves and I get him. So to me, it feels like a loophole to get more slaves.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I get that.
It's wild that it's in here. And remember, God could have said, hey, treat the female slaves the same way you do the male slave.
Right. Yeah. At the
But
very
he
least.
didn't.
At the very least.
Which means God has a lower value on women than men, clearly.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
You know what I mean? But this again coincides with what we read in Genesis chapter 3, was 16, where he says that your desire will be for your husband, but he will rule over you.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
There's definitely this idea in the Old Testament that the women are subservient. Let's read one of the more difficult parts. Let's go on to verse 7, eh?
When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go free as male slaves do.
Right.
I was just thinking, no wonder that women these days are so subservient to men. The Bible, written by men, is just awful in its treatment of women. I also want to say that no self-respecting woman these days would want to call themselves a Christian.
If they read the Bible. Yeah.
No wonder they're fine with letting men make reproductive decisions for them. According to the Bible, women are barely people. And if a woman is a Christian and they read this, then that's what they got to believe, right?
Yeah, you would think so. And also, like, even in Deuteronomy, I think Deuteronomy 25, we see where, like, God doesn't even allow them to have, like, autonomy over their own bodies. So in Deuteronomy 25, it says, when brothers reside together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside of the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her, taking her in marriage and performing the duty of a husband's brother to her, and so on and so forth. And you already know about this because we've talked about this before. So,
yeah.
Like, he doesn't even think like women should have their own autonomy. The most important thing is to preserve the family name of the man.
Right.
Pretty wild.
It is.
It's hard for me to read this law code and think that this is more progressive.
Right.
Especially having actually read the other ancient law code.
And again, I don't care if it's more progressive. I don't care if it is.
Right.
I mean, the law code should say, don't have slaves or I'll smite you. The end.
Right.
You know?
And he could have said it.
Yeah.
You know? He gave over 600 laws. And he said, I'm giving you these laws so that you will be holy as I am. So you won't be like the nations that I'm driving out of the land before you.
Right.
Right. And he actually says elsewhere, let me grab the passage in the Bible. I forget exactly where it's at, but I've got it highlighted. I'll find it in a second. Deuteronomy 12. Verse 28, it says, be careful to obey all of these words that I'm commanding you today, so that it might go well with you and with your children after you forever, because you will be doing what is good and right in the sight of the Lord your God. So you can't really hold on to this idea that these law codes are progressive. Because God says that you should follow them forever, and by following these laws forever, you'll be doing what is good and right in the sight of the Lord your God. So if that's the case, if these verses are to be trusted, then somebody would have to come to the conclusion logically that God's set of morals are just different than ours.
Which is weird, so since God made us and our morals, right? You know what I mean? And so it feels like they should mirror each other.
I think,
and I guess they do for a lot of Christians.
I think morals are inherently subjective. Kind of learn them as people.
I know, but I think not all of them are subjective.
You think some of them are like transcendent?
Yeah, they're absolute.
How's that?
Because there are some things that are just intrinsically wrong. Well, I'll tell you. Somebody said something like, what was that? Like God's word was written on your heart or something. Well, I feel like that's what it is for me. And I know you're gonna, I know what you're gonna say. You're gonna say, because in me, in my opinion, what I think is right is what's right. Now you're gonna say that's what everybody thinks about them.
1,000,000% what I'm gonna say.
Yes, but it doesn't matter because that's still how I feel.
Yeah, but that's how everyone else feels, and they disagree with you.
Yeah, and
so it still becomes this very subjective thing.
I know, but it's not subjective for me.
That's the definition of.
No, it isn't.
The definition of subjective is that it's dependent on your mind.
No. To me, it's not subjective because I believe it's absolute. And people who don't believe it's absolute, I believe they're wrong.
Well, but it would say the same thing about you then. So
right.
How would you know who's right?
I didn't say I could tell who's right. I just said, in my, to me, there are some absolutes, and I understand that you can't prove that, but I still think there are. I mean,
how does a person know what the absolute morals are?
Again, right here.
Yeah, but people who have had them right here disagreed with you.
Well, that's because they were probably not having it. They were probably shysters, or you know what I mean?
So you're just gonna do the no true Scotsman fallacy?
I might.
Wouldn't they say the same thing about you? Well, you're just being a shyster?
Yeah, except they're saying it because they're a shyster, and they don't want to get found out. You're saying it
because you're a shyster.
Yeah, but the only difference is
how easy it is to win an argument when your claim is that the other person is just a bad person, or they're a liar, or they're somehow not a true Christian.
I understand, but my point is, that no true Scotsman fallacy is bullshit.
Not.
No, it really. Good one. No, it's really not.
It's good because you don't get to say that. Well, I know their inner thoughts. I know their heart, and because I know that they're bad people on the inside, I can disregard their opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Like, do you have access to their mental states?
Sometimes, if we see their voting record.
You don't.
I'm going to keep saying that as a joke, just so you know.
Keep in mind, during Trump's first term as president, when he was running for president, you argued with me that he was the better choice. I just want to remind you of that. Was it over 8 years ago now? I had to talk you off the Trump ledge.
No, you didn't talk me off it. I voted for him.
Oh my God. But I thought it was written on your heart.
I think it was probably hate that was on my. We got rid of it.
Sure about that?
No, I mean we placed it elsewhere. Obviously.
All right. Yeah. I see what you're saying, but I think we can kind of sum this up by saying, it would seem that there's a couple things we can conclude so far about this. Either God doesn't care all that much about slavery, or our opinion of slavery is wrong and God's is right.
Okay.
Or possibly this just didn't come from God.
Yeah. Well, I always thought it did, and that was messed up. But when we first started this conversation, you mentioned how a lot of them are very similar to ones that are not in the Bible. Mm-hmm. And that and I'm going to guess that those laws were written before the Bible, right? And that makes me go, maybe these aren't legitimate laws, Now, of course, that means how do you know what law is legitimate?
Right.
And that would lead me to the question, how do you know for sure anything about God?
You don't.
Right.
No.
Except you said you did.
I'm
You
saying
said that you
it
could.
becomes a matter of faith at that.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Can
And
you,
this was a position that I was okay with as a youngster. My religion teacher in Catholic high school said that once. I said, we were talking about some of the difficult historicity of the Old Testament. And I, was kind of questioning her as to, how can we have type of certainty that stuff is true? And she goes, you can't. It's a faith, not a fact. It's a faith. As a young person, I was willing to accept it.
hmm.
I think that's the truth of the matter. Like, when faced with these difficulties, you can try to rationalize them, you can try to remove them, or you can just say, well, I don't have a good answer for it. Maybe God will explain it later.
Hmm.
But me personally, I think the most likely explanation is laws were written by men and placed on the mouth of God, which we have ample evidence of, because everybody in the ancient Near Eastern time periods did that.
Mm-hmm.
They would say that they got these laws from Shamash or from Sin or from any of the other deities of the world, Ea or Enki or so on and so forth, because the laws didn't have power unless they came from God.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, I don't know if that's true, though. I mean, there were nations that had their own laws, right? And they had punishments for them, right? I don't know if they had to come from God, right?
They did, almost all of them.
No. Like Egyptian laws. They would say, here's the laws, and if you don't do it, you're going to prison.
We don't actually have any surviving legal codes of the Egyptians.
Okay, fine.
Isn't that wild?
Yeah, it's, well.
Like, we have so much from them, but we don't have that.
And why is that, you think?
Probably because of virus.
Okay. Helpful.
It degrades easy.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's read 8 through 11 here.
Sure.
Should get fun.
If she does not please her master, who designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed. He shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has dealt unfairly with her. If he designates her for his son, he shall deal with her as with a daughter. If he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish the food, clothing, or marital rights of the first wife. And if he does not do these three things for her, she shall go out without debt, without payment of money. Yeah, so I don't know what the bleep this verse means. So we're gonna go ahead and turn to the message. All right, just pretend that I'm reading it, okay? And can you scroll up, please? So I read the message version.
If I don't scroll up, will you not be able to read it?
I'm still not going to read it to you. Okay. I'm still not going to read it. Did you scroll up? All right, so the point is, I read the message, and it doesn't actually clear anything up. So I asked ChatGPT.
Of course you would, yep.
And basically it says, if the master no longer wants the daughter, I presume, he must allow her to be redeemed and cannot sell her to foreigners. If she's meant for his son, she's treated like a daughter. If he takes another wife, if yada yada. So it doesn't actually matter. It just says to treat women like any other property you own. That's kind of what I took from it.
You're not wrong. So when you purchase a female slave, and even when you adopted a young female, it was typically with the intention of turning them into a wife or a concubine. Like, if you purchased somebody's daughter that was very young, that wasn't a slave, she was going to be somebody's wife in your house. If you purchased a slave, a young slave girl, then she was more likely going to be your concubine. That being said, it's pretty clear in the text that that's kind of what they're suggesting here. It says, if a man sells his daughter as a slave, she won't go free. Well, why won't she go free? Why wouldn't she get to go free? Well, it's obvious. Because she's now sexually united with her slave, because they become concubine and owner. Says, if she does not please her master, who designated her for himself, meaning I've picked you for me, you're my sexual partner, then he will let her be redeemed. And being redeemed is something like if somebody purchases you out of slavery, right? So it's saying here, listen, if you take a concubine for yourself, but you don't like her, then it's okay to let her be purchased back by her family.
Mm-hmm.
And it says, he shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has dealt unfairly with her. And this is actually one of the good things in here, because sometimes in the ancient world they would do that. Like they would buy a young girl as a slave wife or a concubine, and then if they didn't like her, if for one reason or another she just wasn't pleasing to the owner, they would just sell her to the highest bidder. They didn't care who it was. So this particular law is really interesting, because he's saying, listen, because this is a Hebrew woman, you can't just go sell her to anybody you want. You have to give her back to her actual people. You know what I mean? Let her be redeemed by her actual Hebrew people. But this is the interesting part.
Now that's more just because they wanted the Jews to kind of intermix, right?
They interbreed,
stay with themselves is what I mean.
Yeah, they didn't want them joining themselves to foreigners.
So that kind of makes sense why that law would be there, because we've seen how they get with the Canaanites and all that, right?
Right.
And then God's unhappy.
But listen to the rest of the verse.
Okay.
It says, he shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has dealt unfairly with her.
Mm-hmm.
Listen to what's being said, though. He's suggesting that if you do purchase a young Hebrew woman slave,
mm-hmm.
and you designate her to be your concubine, and then you're displeased with her, he's saying that this is not fair to her.
Mm-hmm.
That you would now just let her go, because now she's essentially damaged goods.
Oh, okay.
But it gets worse than that, okay? Because so now it's easier to understand the picture here. He's saying, well, she's basically damaged, and now she may not have a male caretaker, but the text recognizes that this is unfair to the woman. But what it doesn't do is outlaw it. So God is literally
that's interesting,
giving his approval on this unfair practice. Right? Because he says, if she doesn't please her master who designated her for himself, then he shall let her be redeemed, who has no right to sell her. So he's saying, you can listen, if you take her, you purchase her, and then you just want to get rid of her later, this is unfair. But if you do it, make sure you sell her back to her own people, because you're being unfair to her. So what God was under no compulsion to allow this unfair behavior, but he did both allow it and recognize that it was unfair.
That's weird, man. I didn't pick up on that. That's a good one.
Right.
That's a good one.
Now here's the interesting part. It says, if he designates her for his son, then she actually gets treated like a daughter, and that actually seems better. Not so bad. But here's the weird thing. It says, he shall not diminish the food, clothing, or marital rights of the first wife. So he goes back in verse 10 to like, well, what if she's married to the master? So now in verse 10, God is explicitly allowing polygamy. So it is a wild passage to read, because we've got like these really firm ideas in our the modern sense that like God wouldn't allow polygamy, God wouldn't allow slavery, he didn't like concubinage,
right?
But everything in this passage would betray that. So that being the case,
I mean, it's really not just this passage, though. I mean, this is all throughout. Didn't David have sex with his father's concubines or something?
So it was Absalom. Absalom had sex with 10 of David's concubines as a show of force.
Okay.
But it's worse than that. Because in 2 Samuel chapter 12, God says he's the one causing it to happen as a punishment to David. Which is wild.
Yeah.
So God doesn't seem overly concerned with the treatment of women, especially not in their sexual capacity.
Yeah.
And even in like Isaiah chapter 13, he talks about how when he punishes the Israelites, he's going to have their women raped by foreign invaders. So like, and he says the same thing in Jeremiah chapter 8, actually. So there's definitely this idea in the Old Testament that women just don't have the same level, like status as men. They just clearly don't.
Mm.
But it is interesting that here's what I don't fully know, because I haven't seen a lot of ancient Near Eastern law codes on it. But he says, if he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish the food, clothing, or marital rights of the first wife, assuming the first wife is that slave that he purchased. So essentially, what he's saying is, if you marry this little slave wife, and then you take another wife later, you can't treat her poorly now that you have a new wife. You have to treat her the same.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, am I not merciful? But that's the least you could you could do.
Right.
You know what I mean? But yeah, I guess that's probably all I have to say about that. That's a rough section of text.
Well, it doesn't get much easier, right?
No, it's just gonna keep on going. The whole chapter is a rough chapter. Exodus 21's got a lot of
Yeah, well, I bet all of Leviticus is going to be tough then, right? You know what I mean?
it's a slog.
So when were these dated? Do we know?
Well, the section that we're in is usually referred to as the covenant code, and this is like chapter 21 and just a pinch more. And the general consensus among scholars is that this is the best representation of the early law code that was probably given, if there ever was a law code given, in and around Sinai.
Okay.
And this is the oldest section of codes, chapter 21.
Okay. Okay.
That being said, it's hard to know when they were given. They were probably given after the time of David, not the time of Moses. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Scholars who do a lot of dating of the text could better explain why that is the case. But from a linguistic standpoint, the texts that we have couldn't have dated prior to the time of King David. But certainly some of them could be pretty archaic. But the oldest manuscript we have, and we've talked about this before, the oldest thing we have is from a little quote from the book of Numbers from the 6th century, and the Ketef hidden silver amulet. So that's the oldest manuscript fragment we have is 6th century. So we're still missing, anywhere between 800 years and
between when this was purported to be written and when it was actually written.
Right.
When did we say that the priests put this all together?
Well, the priestly code was probably put together, if I had to guess, starting in just after the Assyrian invasion, and probably after the Babylonian invasion began in 605, and a lot of the northerners migrated south into Judea for safety. That's when I suspect a lot of the priestly stuff kind of.
Well, so give me a date.
If I had to guess, like I'm gonna put it like around 605 to 550.
And when was this written? This, the thing in front of us.
Well, that's the problem. Is this probably is older.
Older than
So
the priest?
Yeah, the covenant code is probably quite old. It probably dates a couple hundred years prior to that time period. But there's the caveat is we don't have the evidence of that. Like we don't have the manuscripts.
Yeah.
All we have is internal evidence from the words and like what kind of grammar is being used, what type of words are being used.
Okay.
And you can see that even in English. Like if you read the James, you're like, oh, that's old English.
Mm-hmm.
You find some of the same stuff in the Hebrew text. You can get to the section that we call the covenant code, and you're like, oh, there are some archaic words here that kind of match an earlier time period than some of the rest of the law codes. Same thing with like some of the poetic stuff, like Song of Deborah, whatnot, and the Song of Miriam crossing. these are very old pieces of Hebrew prose and narratives.
So the priests probably had to write it down because it was well known. So they didn't make it up.
Oh, the covenant code?
Yeah.
Well, my opinion is they probably still did make it up. I just think it's a much older.
Well, no, I meant the priests who were putting the Bible together.
Oh, the priestly redactors?
Yeah.
No, I don't think they did. I think it probably pre-existed.
So they had to put it in there because everybody knew about it, right?
I think so. I suspect that this part of Exodus was widely known about in the ancient culture and widely used.
Okay.
There's a really good book. I'll have to get you a copy on the linguistic dating of the Bible, the Hebrew text, that goes over like how you know what sections date to what time period, based on grammar and philology, vocabulary and whatnot. But that being said, maybe we should move on to the next section.
Sure. What are we up to?
We are on 12 and 13.
The law concerning violence.
Right.
All right. Whoever strikes a person mortally shall be put to death. If it was not premeditated but came about by an act of God, then I will appoint for you a place to which the killer may flee. Yep. So God caused death. The message calls it an act of God as well. So what I assume this means is that if someone dies or is killed on accident, then God must have done it to them. And therefore it was justified because they must have deserved it or something. But still the killer still has to go into exile, even though they say it was God. Is that what we're doing here?
Yeah, pretty much it. Yeah. So they had cities or locations for refugees, I guess you would call them. Where if somebody accidentally unalived somebody, that they could flee to this town. I think originally there were 6 of them that were set up, and then they were later increased.
Okay.
I could be wrong on that, but we did cover this when we were in Genesis. But the long and short of it is, if you accidentally killed somebody, you could go to a refugee city and cling to the horns of the altar, and they couldn't come and get you if it was an accident.
Legally, you mean, or
legally? Yeah, cities of refuge.
As long as you didn't set foot out of the city.
Yeah, you gotta be careful. You leave that city, you're not. And forget how many total cities of refuge there were, but there were a couple of them that were set up. But to your point, because it says, if it was not premeditated but came about by an act of God, then I will appoint a place to which the killer may flee, meaning one of the refugees. So the question that you bring up is a good one, which is, why would it be an act of God? Right? And my reading of this is, if in fact somebody, say they quarrel or they fight with another, and then later they die, they might say, well, that was an act of God. I didn't kill him. God must have.
Say that one more time.
Like if I got into a fight with somebody, a couple days later they died.
Okay.
Maybe I caused them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they would probably say, well, this was an act of God. Like he wasn't immediately killed from my doing. He was dead days later. Right? So my suspicion here is that most of these people from the time period expected that if you cause somebody to die, you know that is the case because it's like a direct result of you doing something, like beating them with a rod. Like you know that if they die while you're beating them, that you killed them. But if they die a couple of days later, it's not very clear if you killed them or if it was an act of God. You know what I mean? So my suspicion here is basically God is saying, like, if it's not really clear that you're the reason why they died, then it's basically an act of God. And if that's the case, I'll make a place where you can run to so that you don't get punished for the crime.
Even though it was likely that person who killed them.
Right, but here's the crazier thing, okay? So the cities of refuge are this interesting thing because the assumption is that God may or may not have killed somebody and you got blamed for it. And so you need to go escape somewhere, right?
Yeah.
But for an all-powerful being, if God is the one that kills somebody and there's an innocent party, they can just inquire of God using the casting of lots, the Urim and Thummim, like they do on other occasions, like in Numbers chapter 15 and elsewhere.
Okay.
So it's really interesting because this idea could have been resolved by God just saying, "Hey, listen, if it seems to be an accident, come before me and cast the lots,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll tell you if it was on purpose."
Right.
So this to me is like really ambiguous. You're like, listen, if it seems like an accident, just run for your life. Hope they don't catch you.
Yeah.
Isn't that wild?
It is. Very wild.
All right. So want to read 14?
Sure. But if someone willfully attacks and kills another by treachery, you shall take the killer from my altar for execution.
Right.
Didn't they just say that in verse 12?
No.
Yes, they did.
Not quite.
Whoever strikes a person morally shall be put to death.
Right.
And if somebody attacks another and kills them, they'll be put to death. No.
Again. So what he's saying is if it's an accident, you can run to the city or the place of relief.
Mm-hmm.
If it's not an accident, if it's clearly a murder, then you will go to that place of refugee and you will take them. They're there or not.
Oh, is that what it says?
Yeah. So he said, if somebody willfully attacks and kills another by treachery, you shall take the killer from my altar. My altar is what you would cling to when you're in one of the cities of refuge.
Oh.
But that was, and we see that happening in the Bible. There's a couple occasions where somebody runs from being prosecuted by clinging to the horns of the altar. Let me get the cities. There's probably a list of them. The cities of refuge are Kadesh, Shechem, Hebron, Bezer, Ramoth, and Golin. So there were 6 of them. So
they're cities of refuge unless people decide that the person's really guilty.
Yeah,
and that's just, I mean, I feel like if you kill somebody and then the family member is upset with it, they could easily just say it's treachery, right? I mean,
if you have verifiable proof that they did it,
then
yeah, most likely they'd let you do it. And there is an occasion where Solomon, if I remember correctly, tracks down somebody. Who was it? I think it was a priest or somebody that anointed his brother as king when he was supposed to be king, getting rid of his enemies. And he goes and runs and puts his arms around the altar, and Solomon's like, "Go get him." Let me find the verse so we can read it real quick.
All right.
You can keep reading them.
Okay. Number 15. Whoever strikes father or mother shall be put to death. Number 16. Whoever does that sound where they're constantly sniffling but don't blow their nose, they shall be put to death also.
1 Kings 150. Yeah, it's after the ascension of Solomon. It says, when all the guests of Adonijah got up, trembling, and went their own ways, Adonijah, fearing Solomon, got up and went to grasp the horns of the altar. Solomon was informed, and Adonijah is afraid of King Solomon. See, he has laid hold of the horns of the altar saying, "Let King Solomon swear to me first that he will not kill his servant with the sword." So Solomon responded, "If he proves to be a worthy man, not one of his hairs shall fall to the ground, but if wickedness is found in him, he shall die." Then the King Solomon went to have him brought down from the altar, and he came to do what's that word, buddy? Obeisance.
What am I looking at?
Obeisance.
Oh yeah, obeisance.
That's a crazy word. To Solomon, and Solomon said, "Go home." But so he didn't, and took him from the altar. But there's another occasion where somebody is taken from the altar and killed. Apparently that wasn't the one I was.
Okay.
Oh well.
Obeisance. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Oh no, you didn't. Obeisance. All right, it's gone.
Yeah.
You good?
Yeah. Let's do the thing.
All right.
So the next thing is, do not strike your
father, mother.
Yeah.
Or you're dead.
That's a tough one.
You know, I had nothing to say on that.
It's wild.
I mean,
you would never do that to your parents.
Well, my point is, we were just talking about how if you curse at your parents, you should be put to death. So it would make sense that if you, hit them, you'd be put to death too. Right?
It's kind of an interesting thing that simply striking your mother or father would warrant death penalty.
I mean, no, it's not, because apparently cursing them will kill you too.
Well, but remember,
so none of that's any good.
In most of the law is an eye for an eye.
Right.
So if the law is an eye for an eye, then they should, like, if they strike their parents, they should be stricken. They shouldn't be killed.
This is another reason why I don't think God values life as much as we do.
No, he does not. Top of that food chain are the Hebrew men, then probably Hebrew young men, because they can fight and work.
Yeah.
And then after that, maybe Hebrew women, and then Hebrew male slaves, and then Hebrew female slaves. Then at the very bottom of that list is like babies. He'll kill a baby on point every day. He
right.
don't think about that.
Right.
Drown them all. Hack them up with a sword.
All right, we're done here.
You don't care nothing about no babies.
I know he doesn't. I know he doesn't.
All right. Let's. All right. So you can't listen. You can't strike your father or mother. Here's the thing that always got me. Okay. I never understood, even from an early age. I remember reading this in Catholic school. I do not know why they put verse 16 between 15 and 17.
Yeah.
There is no reason to put a verse between those two verses. It
right.
should say, whoever strikes his father or mother shall be put to death, and whoever curses their father or mother shall be put to death. There's no reason why we should insert whoever kidnaps a person, whether that person shall be sold, has been sold, or is still held in possession shall be put. Crazy. Weird place to put that.
It is. It is very weird.
That being said, hey, don't kidnap free Hebrews.
Yes.
At least that's a good rule.
It's pretty good. I mean, we don't mean kidnapping as in slavery, obviously.
Well, it does seem that way. Like, you can clearly do it to foreigners, because in Deuteronomy 20 and 21, God lets you do it. But it seems, and the whole chapter here is referring to Hebrews. Like, the chapter 21 is about Hebrew on Hebrew action.
Weird way to put it.
I know. Verse 16 seems to be suggesting, and it gets repeated in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy, it clarifies it. Deuteronomy, it says it refers to kidnapping your own Hebrew fellowman.
Mm-hmm.
The Deuteronomy does give a little bit of clarity to it. It's in 15? I forget. But actually, if we just turn on our cross-reference, it'll tell us which part of Deuteronomy. I'm probably wrong. 24. See, I was wrong. 24, it says, if anyone is caught kidnapping another Israelite, slaving or selling the Israelite, then.
Okay.
So the Deuteronomist is under the impression that Exodus, referring kidnapping a Hebrew, and I think that's what he's referring to. That being said, it's interesting that they wouldn't just say kidnapping any person at all ever, because obviously God's not so concerned about the form.
That's right. Kind of interesting, this. I mean, we look at Trump and the Republicans and how they feel about illegal immigrants or legal ones, whatever, and we look at them like they're just I don't know, jerks, barbarians, what have you. But it right here, I mean, it follows, it tracks with the religion.
Right. Yeah.
No.
Right.
Oh.
It really does. Do 18.
Nope, we're doing 17.
I'm sorry, I thought we included that with the verse 15.
Yeah, but you can't just do that. You can't just include verses.
Sorry.
My notes don't jump around.
I apologize.
That's okay. Don't let it happen again.
I'll try not to.
So, whoever curses father or mother shall be put to death.
Right.
So, let's see what curses actually mean. What?
Go ahead.
All right. So, I asked ChatGPT, and ChatGPT has a bug where it thinks Exodus 15, 16, and 17 are all verse 16. I don't know how that happens, but I have tried very hard to get it to realize.
The AI models are not smart.
It's just a weird bug, right? Isn't that weird?
Mm-hmm.
All right. The message also uses curses. Therefore, it's up to you to tell.
Okay. Well, a curse is exactly what you would think it is. Like in today's world, we would think of it like magic. You would curse somebody and something bad would happen.
No, I think you think of it as just swearing at them.
No, that's not what it was.
There's nobody curses anybody like with spells in this day and age.
But that's where the word came from. To curse somebody or to use a curse word didn't mean that you just said something foul. It means you actually uttered a curse against them. You were saying something that was actively trying to harm them. And it was up to the deities to carry out blessings and cursing. That's why all of the ancient contracts would be followed up by various blessings and cursing.
So that's why God was so upset, because he's like, well, crap, now I have to do it. You think that's it?
A little bit, part of it, yeah.
Well,
he can choose not to, obviously.
Can he?
Obviously,
okay.
he can choose anything.
I don't know.
But the fact of the matter is, in the ancient world, a curse was a real thing, and same thing with blessing. But remember, blessings and cursings don't work unless God makes them come true. There's no magic intrinsic property of, which means if somebody is cursed and the curse follows, God must have done it, which does cause a little bit of problems. In fact, I didn't think we were going to talk about this one.
Why not?
But now that we're on it, I guess we kind of owe it to ourselves to cover it.
Oh, yes.
Let's go to 2 Kings chapter 2. We're going to read 3-5. This refers to Elisha the prophet. It says, he went up there to Bethel, and while he was going up on the way, some small boys came out of the city and jeered at him, saying, "Go away, bald head, go away, bald head." When he turned around and saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. Then 2 she-bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the boys. From there, he went on to Mount Carmel and then returned to Samaria. So
Mount Carmel.
This is a curse uttered by one of God's prophets that God causes to come true.
What would he say?
So what? I mean, what curse did he utter?
Yeah, is it like, like how like Wiccans do that stuff?
Well, I don't know how.
Or is there like a Christian type of curse?
I don't know. I don't know. The text doesn't tell us what he said.
Or if he's just like, F all y'all.
Well, I mean, he was probably upset. Probably short and sweet. Probably like, curse you with bears.
Female bears.
What if he just said that in anger and God mistook it? And was like, oh, you want to kill them with bears? Let's do it. And he's like, no, don't do it. God, I was joking.
Man, life is pointless.
Pretty brutal,
right?
God's willing to kill 42 kids for making fun of some pretty.
Yeah. I mean, I know he was God's prophet and all.
But that being said, if you uttered a curse against somebody and it came true,
Mm-hmm.
and that means you harmed them, you did something bad to them.
Mm-hmm.
So uttering a curse against your parents is for sure, roughly the same as striking your parents in this case. Both of them are intended to cause harm.
But only one of them is real.
Well, yeah.
How about that?
For sure.
Yeah.
So, all right, let's do
18 and 19.
Yeah, let's make it happen.
When individuals quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone or fist so that the injured party, though not dead, is confined to bed, but recovers and walks around outside with the help of a staff, then the assailant shall be free of liability except to pay for the loss of time and to arrange for full recovery.
Right.
These verses are pretty specific, aren't they? I mean, this must have been an issue. Like, people were like, hey, he hit me, but I didn't die. Shouldn't he at least pay my medical bills? I also like how you can hit someone, but as long as they can walk around with a staff, it's all good.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much. Okay, so I think the general idea here is that if you hurt somebody, that means they can't work. So this is like workman's comp based. Like if you're the reason why somebody can't, go to work or pick their crops or whatever, like you're liable for that. You got to pay for that. Not a bad rule.
Did these people have savings that they could dig into? Oh, really?
Not yet. They're in the desert.
Oh, but these laws were for the future or something?
Kind of. Although they were given silver and gold by the Egyptians when they left, because remember, God predisposed them.
That's true. That's
or
true.
Disposed or predisposed? Which is it?
I don't think they disposed them.
Yeah, that's not the right word.
I think predisposed is better. Anywho, yeah, there you go.
But it is interesting that in the Bible we do get a little bit of workman's comp. But I think the next two verses are a little more difficult to deal with.
Yeah.
Namely, how much you can or cannot strike your slave. Let's jump right into it and read it here.
When a slave owner strikes a male or female slave with a rod and the slave dies immediately, the owner shall be punished.
Right. I like how you separated 20 and 21. I don't know why you did that. They're the same thing.
But if the slave survives a day or two, there is no punishment. But the slave is the owner's property.
Very good. Okay. Now, just based on the reading of the text, what's your takeaway here?
I'll tell you.
Mm-hmm.
It's okay to beat your slave to death, but make sure he dies slowly.
I think you nailed it. That's kind of what it's saying. I mean, okay, so obviously we know in verse 20 it says when a slave owner strikes a male or female slave with a rod and it dies immediately, then there's punishment. In fact, in the Hebrew it says if he dies under your hand, meaning, while you're beating him, then obviously you killed him. You committed murder. But you also got to remember this is probably a Hebrew. These are all laws for dealing with your own Hebrews. But in verse 21 is interesting, and you read it correctly because a lot of people don't. It says if the slave survives a day or two, there's no punishment. But it doesn't say if he survives after a day or two. In fact, a literal rendering of the Hebrew is, it says, but if the slave stands a day or two, there is no punishment. Meaning, if he survived for a day or two, it's not immediately clear that you killed him. It's presumably an accident. And why would we presume that it was an accident? Because the slave is the owner's. It says property here, but it actually says kesef in Hebrew, meaning silver or money. So they're presuming it's an accident because that slave is your money. You need him, right? But to me, let's imagine we're going to give it the most charity possible that we can. Still kind of weird because, man, 1 or 2 days to survive a bad beating isn't all that long. Like a lot of people could die from internal wounds, a week later. it seems like God really should have stretched that out. But like, hey, listen, if they die, a month later, then we can be sure that it wasn't from the beating.
Mm.
Also, let's say if he strikes him with a rod. Now, I've seen ancient rods. I know that they can hurt and leave bruises, but here's the thing. Have you seen the ancient rods that they beat people with?
The ancient rods, are they pretty big?
No.
Oh. Wait, what?
No, but we think of rods in the modern time like a club or a baseball bat sometimes even, but they weren't anything close to that. They were like dowel rods, basically.
Oh.
They might be even 3/4 of an inch thick, and they could do a lot of damage for sure.
Okay.
But to kill somebody with a rod, man, you got to be beating the crap out of that person. You got to hit them 100, 200, 300 times. You got to strike them in the head. Like you really got to be going after somebody to kill them with a rod, which is wild to me, because if that's the case, if it says that, if they die after a day or two from the beating, dude, the owner is still going off on that dude. Like, for someone to die a couple days later from a beating from a rod, it's still a hell of a beating, man. Even in the Near East, they still do beatings with rods. Have you seen those rods? They're kind of whippy. They're kind of like those police rubber rods they beat people with. You ever see the riot poles?
You mean like a baton?
No.
Oh, then no.
All right, but they're not very thick, and they're whippy. They whip a little bit. They're bendy a little bit, right?
Okay.
And
like a switch.
Yeah, well, it's somewhere between a switch and a rod, right? And I've seen some people use hard rods before that are stiff, but they're really not they're not very big. They leave stings and welts, but they're not like gonna break your bone. You know what I'm saying? But anyways, the long and short of it is, this beating, the type of beating that you would give somebody with one of these ancient rods that would cause them to die a couple of days later, had to have been done in anger. It's weird to me that they would say, well, it must have been an accident. Died only 2-3 days later. Wild to me. Because he still beat the crap out of him.
What's also weird is that was so common enough they needed a law, right?
Yes, that's a fantastic point. It was so common that they needed a law against it.
Yeah.
Right? And here's the other thing. When you beat your slave and the slave dies, you only get hauled into court if the family members of the slaves know about it and they haul you into court. Because who's going to hold you accountable? The dead slave? Right?
Yeah, but it still wouldn't matter, right?
What do you mean?
Why would they haul him into court?
I'm saying in the first instance, in verse 20. If a slave owner kills one of these Hebrew slaves, well, the dead Hebrew slave is not prosecuting him.
Right.
It would have to be a family member.
Oh.
Meaning, if this person has no friends or family members that are willing to prosecute,
so he won't get punished.
No.
Oh.
Well, there were probably lots of dead slaves that never got their revenge on their killer simply because they didn't have any near of kin. Which, if you remember Leviticus 25, that's one of the reasons why they would be a slave in the first place, is because they didn't have a near of kin that they could depend on and work as a hired laborer for. They had to sell themselves into indentured servitude because they were their last resort. But here, you can just beat them.
Yeah.
Pretty crazy.
It is crazy. It is very crazy.
So we move on to the next?
Yeah.
22. How many chapters or verses are in this chapter? I forget.
36.
I thought it's a long one.
Yeah, we can do it.
All right.
When people who are fighting injure a pregnant woman so that there is a miscarriage and yet no further harm follows, the one responsible shall be fined what the woman's husband demands, paying as much as the judges determine. A miscarriage? According to the NIV, it says it's called giving birth prematurely. So I don't
question. I didn't actually look that passage up in the. I didn't read your notes ahead of time, so I didn't look it up in the
Right.
Hebrew. So I
Yeah.
don't. But I can grab it real quick to see what it actually says.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious myself now to what it's gonna say. So it's gonna be this
22.
put it on the screen for
Yes.
so if men are fighting, or if men fight, hurt a pregnant woman. Words cut off. Oh, this is interesting. This means to send out. Yitzah is a verb meaning to send or to like to cast out.
Mm-hmm.
And Yalad typically is a word referring to either giving birth or to a birth as a noun. Or here it's being used in the abstract. Yaladi. That's even so. There's another vowel in there. It's Yoladeya. That's a really interesting form of Yelid. You don't see that form too often. Actually, really curious to know how they came up with this formulation. But the long and short of it is, it's being used as a noun, which means it literally says, to cast out or to send out the child, right? So that's a really interesting way of phrasing it.
Yeah, it sounds like it could be either, so that doesn't help, right?
Let me double check this word isn't another word. It is yatzah, like I said, meaning to go out or to come out. This is why I hate this website, is when they do their interlinear translation, they're not giving you a direct translation of the word. They're just like overlaying what the King James Bible says. You can never trust the English translation for words on the interlinear. But this word means to send out. So literally in the original text, it means, that the child has been sent out.
So
What we don't know is if it was being born,
right,
or if it was accidentally discharged.
right.
Which is why I think the NRSV got this one right. It says that there's a miscarriage, meaning the child has been cast out of the womb.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Be a miscarriage.
All right, so you think it is a miscarriage and not a premature birth?
Right. That's what I think.
So a miscarriage is worth a steep fine. Though it's kind of vague on how much. Still, it's apparently not considered murder.
Well, I mean, a miscarriage doesn't always end in death, does it?
What? Of the child?
Give me a second to think on that.
All right.
Yeah, I guess you're right, because if the child comes out and is premature, we wouldn't call it a miscarriage.
We
would
wouldn't. No.
This might not be the best application of the word,
Okay.
because I'm not reading it as the baby always dies. I'm just assuming that the baby comes out of the womb early.
Well, then it's giving birth prematurely.
Yeah, that's probably a better way to say it.
Well, then this isn't a good translation.
Yeah, I didn't see anything about the baby dying in that passage. Not until we get later on. It says, if any harm follows, you give life for life. Meaning, if the baby dies, you give life for a life. But the baby could survive. It's not saying the baby died in the womb. It's just saying that the baby exited the womb during the fight.
Okay. I don't know why they need to even mention that. I'm sure that does not happen that often. That two men are fighting and there's a pregnant woman nearby and they accidentally bump her and she gives birth prematurely.
Yeah, that's a really interesting situation, because how often are two men gonna fight to the point where they're gonna injure somebody's wife that's pregnant?
Mm-hmm.
Like a rare situation.
Yeah, so why do they include this?
They're violent, maybe. They're very aggressive people.
Maybe they are.
To be fair, the Arabs are known as very passionate.
Passionate. Okay. All right.
In fact, my Well, my ex-wife was Egyptian.
I do.
A lot of the men in her family and extended family were pretty excitable, I would say. And even when she got mad, she'd be like, "Well, that's my Arab side." Lack of something that is. Like, so there is kind of this expectation in the Arab culture that the men were kind of passionate and a little bit angry. I would imagine that stereotype was true even back then. But then again, I want to say, I want to lump everybody in this. But that being said, it's interesting here. It says eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for a hand, foot for a foot, but so on and so forth. But in the next section of verses, when we read 26, 27, it's clear that it doesn't apply to everybody. It only applies to free people.
All right, so life for a life.
Right.
So if any harm follows to the child?
Well, see, we're not really sure about that. And my way of reading this is no.
Okay, if the woman dies giving birth, or what?
I always read this as the woman being injured. If any harm follows, then you shall give life for a life.
So you got
the woman, not to the baby, because we find other laws in the Old Testament about a baby being, we'll say, prematurely killed.
So what do you got to do for a life for a life? Does the guy die then?
Yeah, life for life. You take another life, you get killed, buddy.
I don't know why it says it like that. If any harm follows, that guy will be put to death.
Yeah.
Isn't that what it says a lot of these times?
Yeah, but
it just says life for life. It's just weird.
I don't think it's weird.
Well, you're wrong.
I didn't think it was weird at all.
All right. I'm going to mention something about this. All right.
All right, go for it.
So again, Jesus came to fulfill the law. Except that Jesus says in Matthew, "Ye have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, resist not him that is evil, but turn the other cheek." Yada yada yada. So doesn't that contrary? You know what I mean? So I'm confused. Why is it like that? He said he was fulfilling the law, right? But this law we're changing around.
Yeah. So this is some of the push and pull that you get with Matthew. Because the Jesus of Matthew is pro-law of Moses, but he has a particular way that he thinks it should be read and interpreted. And so he is kind of the opinion that the spirit of the law can overrule the letter of the law, if that makes sense.
I get that.
I think we talked about this once before. The problem is, how do we determine what the spirit of the law is? I think Jesus had a unique approach to this. Not that he was the only one doing it, but he was the most well known for it, probably.
I don't think this is the spirit of the law, which is to say, an eye for an eye. Therefore, the spirit of the law is to do nothing. That doesn't make any sense.
Well, right, but you gotta remember, when Jesus came, he had all of the law to work with. We're only addressing the parts of the law that we've had so far.
Okay.
But if you go into other parts of the law, we find verses that would lead us to believe that we should forgive and that we shouldn't seek retribution. I think Jesus is trying to say, in totality, we can glean from the law that this eye for an eye stuff isn't necessary. I think Jesus would have treated that the same way he treated divorce, when he basically said, that Moses allowed you to get a divorce, but at the beginning that was not God's plan. So, God only allowed it because of the hardness of your heart. I think Jesus would probably take a couple laws, like the harsh laws from the Old Testament, probably put it into that category, if I had to guess.
That makes no sense. All right.
Like the category of, like, God didn't actually intend this to be the case, but because you're stubborn or because he couldn't do anything else.
God didn't intend for people to eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, right. Except God said it in a million different ways.
That's why I disagree with Jesus, because I don't think Jesus is treating the Old Testament with any type of proper hermeneutic. We did that with any other book, people would say that we're being silly.
Mm.
And of course, people will come along, they'll say, well, Jesus is God, so he can just change the laws.
That's dumb.
But we've already covered in the Old Testament where God says to follow the law forever.
Mm-hmm.
So if God says to follow the law forever, guess what? Then then he comes later and says, oh, I'm God and now I'm changing it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, a normal person would be like, well, no. We already got the word from God. God said forever.
Right,
So
yeah.
if you're telling me something different, that means either you're lying or God's lying. I'm going to think that you're the liar.
I get it.
But
I get it.
Right.
So it's just one of those things. All right.
But it is an interesting deterrent, this eye for an eye policy. Think about that for a second. If you steal something from somebody, knowing that if you get caught, they'll steal it back from you or whatever, you cut somebody's leg off and your leg.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pretty good deterrent.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
I mean, yeah, but for some reason we've determined that's not right in our society.
Right, we're more merciful.
Thank God.
Yeah, most merciful.
Okay, yeah. See, there's nothing to say to that one, is there?
This is why a lot of people who have been through the Old Testament want to cling so tightly to this idea of progressive morals in the Bible, where God had to progressively move them through the moral systems to, But to me, that's just the advantage of having hindsight, saying, well, humanity is better now than it was then, so God had to slowly move you through the progress. But in reality, that would have happened with or without God, because it happened in all the other societies that didn't have Yahweh.
Mm-hmm.
They all went through the same transformation that the Israelites went through. So it'd be silly to blame it on God.
Yes, it would.
But let's grab 26 and 27.
When a slave owner strikes the eye of a male or female slave, destroying it, the owner shall let the slave go, a free person, to compensate for the eye. If the owner knocks out a tooth of a male or female slave, the slave shall be let go, a free person, to compensate for the tooth. So,
Sure.
If I were a slave, I'd be trying my hardest to get my teeth broken, I mean, I almost understood with the eye thing, but a tooth? I'm sure this means more than I think it does, right?
Yeah, a lot there. So this is kind of an interesting passage because it says something that I think everybody of the time period understood, but it's lost in today's time period.
Mm-hmm.
So in today's time period, if you lose an eye or you lose a tooth, like, we can work on that. We can do dental work. We can do something to your eyes to help them come back. But in the ancient world, when you lost a teeth or eyeball, like, you lose your livelihood, you lose your ability to work. Like,
Yes, I understand with
destitute.
your eye, but you still the tooth.
What are you going to eat with?
You got other teeth?
No. In the ancient world, tooth loss was
They only had one
prevalent.
tooth. Okay. What? So what?
Teeth loss was prevalent in the ancient world. It wasn't like today where you might have all your teeth 40s. By the time you were 40 something, you were lucky to have enough teeth to still eat meat with.
That's weird.
No, they didn't have toothbrushing and oral care like today.
Or most importantly, fluoride.
Yeah, fluoride, right?
I don't know why you laughed. Fluoride in our water, that's really good.
To have your teeth knocked out was a very serious thing because it basically reduced you to the point where you couldn't even, eat the amount of calories that you needed to. Now you got to find a way to gum your food to death.
Oh, and so they're just going to let them go free. Be like, well, you're on your own. Is that right? I mean, okay. It's a nice idea, but it doesn't seem in practice that it's that nice. Well,
I think the general idea here is if you go overboard and beat your slave so much that they can no longer that you're risking them indemnity, where they won't be able to survive.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very serious offense, and if you commit that offense, then guess what? You shouldn't be owning.
Right. Or that one in particular.
Right. But remember, you can beat their body with rods as much as you want, as long as they don't die. And remember, don't knock out their eye or their teeth. So the general idea here is don't kill them, and don't do something that would end in their death later. Right? It has to be an accidental death. Right? You can beat them, but make sure they die by accident.
Or 2 days later.
Yeah, at least 2 days later. Yeah, and make sure they got their eyes and their teeth when they die.
Yes.
Crazy.
Yeah, it is. And yet, I know this is crazy, but I'm pretty sure slavery in America, they didn't even do any of that. You know what I mean?
Well,
like, you just let them die. Nobody cared. Like, they had no rights. You know what I'm saying?
So there's been quite a few people that have written on this topic and have made exhaustive lists of the slave laws in the Americas.
Okay.
They're roughly the same as the slave laws that we're reading now. They weren't much different. The question is whether or not they followed this slave. They really didn't.
Okay.
And we would imagine that they probably didn't at this time period either. A lot of them didn't follow the slave laws. But there are slave laws on the books. Some of the more popular ones are like the Virginia slave laws. But there is, I'll have to find the book for you later when we're offline. But there is an entire book that kind of went through the documentation of these old American slave laws, because a lot of people think that in America, like, you could just buy a slave, and if you don't like them, just beat them to death. You just kill them, you know. But it actually wasn't quite like that. At least not from a legal standpoint.
Right.
From a reality standpoint, it was like that. Probably way worse than that.
Yeah.
But it's not on paper.
Right.
But
okay.
Let's talk about goring oxes, eh?
Let's do it. When an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten. But the owner of the ox shall not be liable. So I actually agree with this. I mean, you hear about animals like gorillas or dogs mauling people to death, and then others are like, it's just an animal, it doesn't know it did anything wrong, or, well, the human shouldn't have been in their habitat, you know? But to me, if an animal kills a human, you kill the animal, simply because we must make sure everyone knows that human life is more valuable than an animal. And it does seem odd that you can't eat the meat, though. But I presume it's just one of those, now it's unclean things.
Well, it's a little bit of that, but also look at the method of death. Stoning.
What's that?
Stoning.
The ox will be stoned. Okay.
Yeah, they're stoning the ox. Typically, you would kill an ox, you would slaughter it with a knife.
Okay.
When you gave an burnt offering, you killed it with a knife and drained its blood and so forth.
Oh, so this would have its blood still?
Well, it would have its blood still, but also the goal of this punishment is to inflict harm on the ox.
Okay.
It's not just dying, it's a painful death, which is the other thing, because God demands that people be stoned well.
Which is weird for animals, since it's not like, I mean, yes, they should be killed if they kill a human, but it's not like they're going to understand why they're getting hurt or whatever. You know what I mean? That seems needlessly cruel.
Right. All that being said, they could have just said, kill the animal.
Right.
Cut its neck. For example, we already talked about in Exodus, where it talks about offering up your firstborn, and then
right.
it says of the humans, let them be redeemed. But if it's a donkey, break its neck.
Yeah.
So there's this interesting passage in Exodus where we know that they could kill a donkey just by breaking its neck. We also know from other passages they can do it by slitting the throat. But neither one of those are mentioned here with the ox. You're not breaking the ox's neck. You're not slitting the throat. You're literally stoning it to death. I can only assume the goal here is to make the animal suffer.
Yeah.
As it's dying.
Yeah.
Can you imagine being stoned to death?
I don't like to think about that.
That's one of the worst ways to go, isn't it?
That sounds very painful.
Because if you're going to be stoned, right? The only way, right, and then you're no longer conscious while they're killing you.
I mean, I assume the reason for stonings was that it was a community thing. So everybody was responsible for the
Part of
death,
it,
right?
yeah. That was part of it, yeah. And we'll get into that when we get to Deuteronomy 17.
Nice. So nice.
So,
Okay.
50.
Well, what book is after this one?
So we got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, then Deuteronomy.
Oh, Leviticus is next.
It's gonna be a blast.
Nope. All right.
All right, verse 29.
Yes. If the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has been warned, but did not restrain it, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner shall also be put to death. That's, yeah, I mean, how many times have you heard of dogs mauling people where the owner, knew the dog was a menace? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I mean, it makes sense in a society like this where it's an eye for an eye. And, yeah, you can't have people like that.
Yeah, if you've got an ox and it's known to be harming people and you don't do anything about it, and it goes off and kills somebody, hey man, you're responsible for that.
Right.
So I agree. I think given the other laws of the chapter, this makes sense. Right? Okay. Verse 30.
If a ransom is imposed on the owner, then the owner shall pay whatever is imposed for the redemption of the victim's life. So, even back then, if you were rich, you could buy your way out of legal troubles. Maybe that's why Christians love capitalism so much.
Well, I think what's being said here is if the person, you're about right. I mean, there's not a better way to say it. If there's a ransom that is very clear here, the ransom is for the individual that got killed.
Right. So, what? Well, yeah, I know. And so instead of being punished by, dying himself,
right,
he's given probably the family a bunch of money.
But yeah, exactly. The family could say, rather than killing the owner, I'd like them to pay the ransom.
Right.
For the individual, and then they would pay a hefty sum. Yeah, which to be fair, if you're living in this time period, say your Uncle Bob gets gored by an ox, would you rather the owner of the ox die, or would you rather them have to split their estate with you? Because killing the guy who owned the ox isn't going to bring your Uncle Bob back. You know what I mean? And that's kind of how I've always felt about retribution. Like, people, a lot of times when somebody commits a horrible crime, people want the other person to be punished dearly and to suffer or die. But it's not going to bring your loved one back. You know what I mean? It feels good in the moment.
Yeah, that's stupid, and I'll tell you why. Because nowadays you don't split your belongings with people like that. You know what I mean? There's nothing going on there. You either get the retribution or you get nothing. Might as well get one of them.
Fair enough. Kill the owner.
I think that makes sense. What I said.
Right.
I don't like the idea of rich people. To just buy their way out of anything. They do very much have that ability, but I don't like it. It shouldn't be an option.
Actually, the point that you're bringing up is really good here, because let's imagine, for example, that the guy who owns the ox is incredibly wealthy. Everybody knows it. Everybody knows he's wealthy, which means the wealthier you are in this society, the more likely it is that you're going to pay a ransom rather than die. Pretty crazy. Read 31 and 32. These are really fun.
They do look like fun. If it gores a boy or a girl, the owner shall be dealt with according to the same rule. If the ox gores a male or female slave, the owner shall pay to the slave owner 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned.
Yeah.
It's funny because that's how much Judas was paid to kill Jesus. I bet that's a coincidence.
It is a coincidence, but also...
Well, I was saying because it probably isn't.
What?
A coincidence.
Oh, it's not?
Well, I mean, it's 30 shekels. How often do you pay 30 shekels for a person?
Pretty often.
Probably not that often, yeah.
There were 30 shekels paid to the bad shepherd in Zechariah, and there were 30 shekels paid for the field in the book of Jeremiah. Now we've got 30 shekels for the, for the slave.
Well, I don't think so.
But I think you're missing the point here.
Oh, really?
Well,
But there's more. There's
right.
more. I might not have missed it.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So a slave's life is worth approximately between $90 and $3,000. That doesn't really help, but let's just say it's still not a lot of money. Yeah, when you, it's obvious that God doesn't consider, slave valuable. But nowadays, if you kill an unborn baby, all of a sudden they're priceless.
Right.
All right.
It's interesting here that the boy or the girl, the child that gets killed by the ox, they do get the same treatment.
I mean, I should hope so.
But the slave, not so much. And if you ever wondered if slaves had equal value to non-slaves, here's your answer. The answer is no.
No.
Because if it was an adult, it would be an eye for an eye.
Mm-hmm.
Even a child is an eye for an eye.
Right.
So the slave is actually lower than the children of the owner in status.
Mm-hmm.
You're lower than children. And according to Deuteronomy 21, you can kill your children. According to the chapter we just read, you can sell your children as slaves.
Mm-hmm.
So slave, it is the lowest status of society. You can't get any lower. You might as well be an animal after that.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yes.
let's do 33. We might actually do the whole chapter here. Look at this.
Well, can you scroll up for me?
Yeah. 33 and 34.
If someone leaves a pit open or digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make restitution, giving money to its owner, but keeping the dead animal. That's his.
Isn't that wild? That they had to include that?
So does that mean they get to eat it this time?
It would seem that way. That's why you would keep it.
Right, yeah.
You wouldn't keep it to bury it. No one cares about that.
Right. So, isn't that weird? I think that's weird. And how often does this happen? Again, these laws, some of them are like, gonna dig a hole and somebody's gonna have an animal fall into it, and I don't know. It's just weird.
It seemed very occasional.
Right.
How many occasions would you have? First of all, what are you digging a pit for? I can only assume, and here's why a lot of these laws reflect a later time period.
Okay.
Because they're in the desert. They're not out there digging pits. The reality is these are probably irrigation canals that they're referring to. Irrigation canals are only dug once you've settled in a land.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Maybe they were digging for wells out in the desert, though.
Well, that is a thing. Yeah, you could dig for a well, but typically you wouldn't refer to it as a pit. You'd refer to it as a well, right? But that being said, it's hard to know all the reasons why they might have a pit being dug, but I've always read this as being most likely remnant of the agricultural practices that they had been probably digging irrigation. They weren't as known for it as like the Mesopotamians
or the Cappadocian.
Oh, of course.
Look that one up, guys. It's true. All right.
But certainly there's a couple reasons why. But it doesn't seem to match their lifestyle currently, just wandering around in the desert. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I get it. You're probably right. But maybe not. All right.
All right.
35 and 6.
35 and 36.
If someone's ox hurts the ox of another so that it dies, then they shall sell the live ox and divide the price of it, and the dead animal they shall also divide. But if it was known that the ox was accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner did not restrain it, the owner shall restore ox for ox, but keep the dead animal.
Right.
So, is it weird that they split the money evenly?
It is a little bit weird, but I think essentially what they're saying is that that ox is going to be turned into food. So you're not necessarily losing it because you are going to eat it. It is a little bit weird though that there wouldn't be restitution.
But that's what I'm saying. It's still just I mean, especially with everything else. I mean, this is like the first time they're like showing mercy or something. I don't know. You know, you'd assume what you would do is just kill the other guy's ox.
You would think so, yeah. But there is restitution. It says they shall sell the live ox. So the one that killed the other ox, they have to sell it to the guy who has the dead ox. And then they divide the price of it.
What?
Well, hold on. So he gets an ox at half price for his dead ox, but it keeps going. The one that's dead gets divided.
Mm-hmm.
So now he gets the second half of the ox. So now basically they both get one dead half ox and the price for one live ox. But there's no real punishment because it's presumed to be an accident.
It doesn't say that it's being sold.
So that it dies, then they will sell the live ox. Well, who has the live ox?
The guy whose ox is alive?
Yeah, the guy who had the ox that did the killing.
It seemed as though what was going on was they're going to market and they're going to try to get, you know, as much as they can for the ox, and then they're going to split the money between the two of them. That's what I thought.
Well,
it sounds weird.
That is plausible the way you say that.
It sounds weird that you would sell your live ox to the person. Like, they killed your ox, so now you're selling them your ox and dividing the price of it. What does that mean? You're dividing the price?
That's a fair point, because it doesn't say who they're selling it to. It very well could have been to a third party, and then they divided the money from the ox, and that is actually more fair to the person with the dead ox. That actually makes more sense.
Okay.
I like that. You changed my mind. I think that's the right way to read it.
All right, sweet.
I think he's selling it to a third party, and then he's giving half of the money to the person as restitution.
Right.
But if it's on purpose, then it's more serious. Or, you know, if he's known to have an ox that was accustomed to gore in the past, then there is he actually has to restore it, one full ox for the ox.
But listen to this. But he still gets to keep the dead animal?
It doesn't really say who.
Right.
It says the owner shall restore the ox for ox, but
keep the dead animal.
So it seems like the guy
who's
got the goring ox gets to keep the dead one.
Yeah, and that's not good, because that's a bunch of free food, right?
Well, it's almost like an exchange, right? So if you've got an ox that gores another ox, and you kill somebody else's ox, you're like, okay, well, I want your ox. You can take the dead one. I'll take the live one.
Okay.
You know what I mean? That's kind of the way I'm reading that.
Okay. I believe that.
I think it's a fair exchange. Like if I go in and, you know, break your tool, break your table saw, I'm like, okay, well, I guess you get my table saw now. I'm stuck with your broken one. I got to go fix. You know what I mean?
Like all the other tools I broke that are in your garage right now.
We don't have to worry about that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is there a 37 verse on this one, or does it end at 36?
Well, in my translation, there's not.
Right.
I bet there is a 37th.
Where did that verse come from?
Oh, because I bet you didn't use the NRSV because you never use the proper translation ever.
That's because it's confusing. I used the ESV or something.
Yeah.
Let's
see what you actually. Yeah, you use the NABRE again for like the fourth week in a row. I told you not to.
I don't think that's what. Anyhow.
Which is why this has a verse 37 that matches exactly what you were.
Why does it have a verse 37 and the others don't?
So because it's probably scripts they don't. So let me double check to see if there's a footnote. I bet there is. Oh, there's not. But I've got the Net Bible here.
The Net
translation and manuscript footnote. A lot of them actually. I bet it actually has. It's the Net Bible with full notes is really cool. Looking into why the translators are doing certain things. So in this Bible, it ends at 36. Actually, there's no 37. Oh, I see what they've done. They've included 37 in the beginning of chapter 22,
Oh.
which is, I bet, the same thing that the NRSV did. I bet the NRSV kept it.
Oh.
They retained it, but put it in 22. So if we go back to the RSV 22, yeah, when someone steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters themselves, it. So there must be some disagreement on why the verse divisions are there differently, and there is a footnote on this. It says, beginning with 21:1, the verse numbers through 22:31 in the English Bible differ from the numbers in the Hebrew Bible, in the BHS, the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, with 21:1. So essentially, it's basically just saying that the way the English is laid out is different than the way that the Hebrew text is laid out verse-wise, and they've just modified it to agree with the Hebrew. It's fine.
Okay, so it's just one of those things where people don't know where it should go?
Yeah, because the verse numbers are actually slightly different in different languages. Like the verse numbers in the Greek Septuagint of the Old Testament don't always match the Hebrew text or the English text.
Of course, it doesn't matter.
Not really.
These are added much
Thousands of years
later. So I mean, this would all just be one big run-on, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter at all.
In fact, there's an option on Bible Gateway. You can just get rid of the verse number.
Oh.
And read it in long form.
Oh.
Isn't that cool?
I don't like that.
No, you don't like
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're just supposed to memorize it, buddy.
Yeah. Somebody said something up there.
It says, donkey in the ditch refers to an emergency. The doctor should still work on the Sabbath to save life, or if you were to come across a car in the ditch during the wintertime, you would render aid, etc. Shalom, shalom, free Oklahoma. Well, that is true, because Jesus says in the New Testament, if a donkey falls into a ditch on the Sabbath, would you pull it out? And this is also echoed in the Talmudic writing. This whole spirit of the law, the superseding the letter of the law, does get brought up in the Talmudic writings. We should when we get done with this section of laws here, before we get into the tabernacle stuff, we should maybe take a look at how some of these laws actually got applied by the Jewish rabbis, because they kind of had their own ideas of, yes, the law says this, but this is how it really should be applied. Because, like, we think of Jesus coming along in Matthew chapter 5 and, like, revolutionizing things by saying, you've heard it said that do this, but actually, well, Jesus wasn't unique. The Jewish rabbis have been doing that for hundreds of years, saying, like, Moses said to do this, but basically kind of means this other thing that, if you look at it and squint the right way, and you know what I mean?
And you said that anybody can be a rabbi.
Well, typically in the ancient world, anybody could be a rabbi, but to be a respected rabbi, you had to study underneath another respected rabbi. There was a chain of succession, basically.
How did Jesus become a rabbi?
Well, as far as I can tell, he was probably trained as a youngster by an unknown rabbi, a lesser-known rabbi, which is why so many people didn't take him seriously. If he was trained by Gamliel or another rabbi that was very popular, then most likely he would have been taken more serious by the elders, but he wasn't taken by them. Killed him.
They did. They did kill him.
He got one of those, like, University of Phoenix online rabbi
or he went to DeVry.
He went to DeVry Rabbi School.
Yeah.
Oh boy. All right, well, that's all we got for the week.
That's it.
Yeah, thanks for much for hanging out with us on what is one of the more difficult reads in Exodus. Sure. There's a lot of difficult passages. There's a lot to
just smooth sailing from here on out. Right?
Well, there's some boring chapters coming up, but
it's called Leviticus.
Well, we would say less bloody and less horrific chapters.
Well, maybe we can speed through them if they're so boring.
We'll speed run some of the tabernacles.
Oh, like when they talk about how you're supposed to build it and stuff?
I mean, listen, if you want to spend an hour on candelabras, we can do that.
Okay, sure, sure.